So for people of a certain age, after just hearing that song, I know what you're thinking of already, and God bless Phoebe Cates, right? Along the way. That's kind of what I'd say to that one. But the Cars debut
You want some numbers,
album,
Josh or John?
I would like some numbers,
I want
Matt.
some
I
too.
always forget.
Josh, you can have the numbers. The Cars, comes in at number 76 on Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, number 3 in 1978, number 294 of all time. It is their highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and it also did make Rolling Stone's list, coming at number 353.
All right, so who are the Cars, guys? The Cars were formed in 1976 in lovely Boston, Massachusetts. They did not start in Boston, which, much like you, I guess, Matt, with AC/DC, I just had always thought the Cars were from Boston, right? But they actually gravitated to Boston from the Midwest, most notably Columbus and Ann Arbor. But we'll get there in a second. The members of the Cars, and this is their debut album, although many, especially Rick Ocasek and Benjamin Orr, the first two members, we'll say, were in multiple other bands together. But just so you know, Rick Ocasek is the rhythm guitarist, the vocalist, and the primary songwriter. Benjamin Orr is the other vocalist and the bass player. David Robinson, not to be confused with the basketball player, guys, is on drums. Greg Hawkes is on keyboards, and Elliot Easton is the lead guitarist. So that is the five that are on this album. The band was named the Best New Artist in 1978 by Rolling Stone. This album sold 6 million copies and stayed in the Billboard 200 for 139 weeks.
Wow.
And overall, the band has sold over 23 million albums. They have had 4 top 10 hits in their career, but believe it or not, none of them were on this album, which is kind of remarkable because the Cars themselves jokingly refer to this album as their greatest hits album. And yet none of their top 10 hits are on it. Do you want to play a game, guys? What are the 4 Cars songs that were top 10 hits?
Oh my
God. Would probably...
It's got to be all from stuff from Heartbeat City. It's got to be like...
So go ahead, take it.
You Might Think.
You Might Think is 1, yep.
Drive.
Is 2, yep.
This album.
You said Tonight She Comes, Matt, so I'll give
Tonight
you
She
that
Comes,
one.
yep. And actually, I thought that was on Heartbeat City. That actually was a...
The album before it, right?
No, it was on a Greatest Hits album. It wasn't on a proper album. It was a bonus track. It was like a Last Chance with Mary Jane for Tom Petty. It's like an album, a song that they just put on the Greatest Hits.
With your Cars knowledge.
Well, I just looked it up because I wanted to listen to Heartbeat City. I was like, it's got what's the 4th?
It's another single, for obviously top 10 hit.
Of course.
It's Shake It Up.
Shake It Up. Okay. Yep.
There you go. So that's their 4 top 10 hits.
Wow.
So, a little bit of background on the band. Ocasek and Orr met in the 60s, believe it or not. And I think one thing I always forget is when the Cars hit, they actually were older than the average band at this time. I do remember reading, I think it was Rick Ocasek was close to 40 when Heartbeat City came out, Matt, which is pretty amazing. So around, that would have been 84, so this would be 77 when it was being recorded. So they would have been in their close to mid-30s at this point.
They're like the Bill Withers of New Wave.
Yeah, for sure. But these guys were, unlike Bill Withers, he was working like a blue-collar job, right, and then just decided to record himself at 32 or 33, I think was his. Now, on the other hand, Ocasek and Orr met in the 60s and were performing all the way back then. So they met. Orr was in a band called the Grasshoppers, and get ready, there's a lot of bands that they're in with different names. So Orr's in that band. Ocasek meets him and becomes a member of that band, and then they start playing in multiple bar bands with different names in Columbus, Ohio, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, which I found interesting because that's where Ohio State and Michigan are, and obviously those two schools don't like each other very much, but more power to them. They actually end up moving together to Boston in the early 1970s. I thought it was interesting, too, that Rick Ocasek, before he moved, was in college for a while and then just decided to not do that and commit to music. They create a 3-person folk rock group, guys, called Milkwood, and they actually have an album that you can listen to if you're curious to hear what that sounds like. It's called How's the Weather? I did listen to it for a while. It does not sound like the Cars at all. They said that they were trying to pattern themselves after Crosby, Stills, and Nash. You can see a little bit of that, although it is weird because their voices do sound the same, right? To like how they sound on the Cars. Mm-hmm. So it kind of is like the voices you recognize from the Cars playing folk rock. So that didn't give me it gave me a like Crosby, Stills, and Nash vibe only in the sense that theoretically it was the same genre, but not at all in terms of how it sounded, right? So the three members of Milkwood combine with Hawks, who is now the third member of what would eventually become this Cars band, to form Richard and the Rabbits. And that is actually a name that was suggested to them by Jonathan Richman, who you may remember is from the Boston area as well, from the Modern Lovers. So he does that. It's always amazing, I think, how these bands know each other before they become somebody, you know? Mm-hmm. And in this case, that Modern Lovers album, I think, was from 1975, and this would have been a little bit before that. And the Cars, you know, obviously aren't even together for 2 more years. So interesting they run in those cycles. But that band disbands, and Orrin O'Kasich start another band, not with Hawks, but with Elliot Easton this time, who's the fourth member of the eventual Cars. He, much like Hawks, had also studied at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. The band's name was Cap'n, like the Cap'n Crunch, right? The Cap'n spelling there. Cap'n Swing. And this was the place where Rick Ocasek starts writing the songs, a lot of them that would go on this album that we're going to listen to. So the group continues to send out stuff. They get rejected by a bunch of labels, and Ocasek finally has one of those like come to Jesus moments where it's like, we're going to change our sound. He gets rid of the band's bass and drum players, and that leaves him with just him, Orr, and Elliot Easton, the guitarist. He brings back Hawks. Orr moves to the bass. He was not playing the bass before. He moves to the bass, and David Robinson joins, who becomes the drummer. So now you've got the actual 5 members that are the Cars.
And he was the guy. He was in the Modern Lovers, right? Wasn't there a Modern Lovers
you
tie-in?
are absolutely. And you beat me to it by a couple seconds. Matt. Yeah. Oh no worries. David Robinson was in the Modern Lovers, and so that's how he ends up connecting to earlier episodes we have. So excellent call there, Matt, because that's where he comes from. And Robinson actually suggests the name, the Cars, and he actually is largely credited for the Cars' aesthetic look, which became obviously a big piece of all of their package, right? For new wave bands it was a big deal, but also later they became kind of an unlikely MTV darling. And some of that was because of them kind of having cutting edge aesthetics a little bit. So
yeah, it's weird how much I associate the Cars with MTV, because that's kind of what I remember.
Well, that was a big piece of what became like kept them relevant, right? Is because they do this album, then they do Candy-O, and then they kind of fall off a little bit, and they kind of get reinvented by MTV. So anyway, that's for another conversation down the road. They play their first show on New Year's Eve in 1976 at an Air Force base, which is an interesting origin story. They tour New England relentlessly. They take those songs they wrote in the Captain Swing era and refine them to make them sound like a lot of different genres, but I think the two that come up the most for the Cars are sort of that 50s rockabilly sound mixed with new wave, I think would be the two sounds that jump off the page most, and people kind of where they were going with the songs. Just What I Needed finds its way onto rock radio in New England, and the band pretty much gets offered 2 record deals right away, which for a band that constantly wasn't getting them before must have been thrilling. They get offers from Elektra Records and Arista Records. They pick Elektra Records because Arista had several other new wave bands, and they wanted to be the only new wave band. They thought they'd get promoted better, which ends up being exactly what happens. They become kind of a radio darling, which we've talked about before. How important, we've talked about with Boston, I think is the one that comes to mind immediately, but how important rock radio is. Apparently
Rush
it was really
too.
Rush as well, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's just interesting because Boston kind of was this story 2 years. The story of Boston and the story of the Cars is actually kind of weirdly similar. Both, that they move into the area, right? Boston, and I think in Scholl's case, he was at MIT, right, where a lot of the members of this band are from Berklee College of Music. They get radio airplay just out of nowhere, and then boom, they hit, and before you know it, they have a huge album. And that's a little bit of what happened with the Cars, too. This album drops in June of 1978. Remember, they started on New Year's Eve, 1976. So that's about a year and a half. Remember, they recorded the album in that time, too. So that's a pretty brisk pace. And it does feature 3 top 100 hits and 3 additional singles. I won't go too far ahead because we can talk about this a little bit. I'll give a little bit of information at the end of this because the Cars story is, I wouldn't say sad, but it has one of those interesting breakup stories. But yeah, I guess we'll start with Matt on this one. Matt, what are your thoughts on the Cars debut album?
Is it me or is it Josh?
You can start. That's fine.
Want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the Cars for me is one of the first bands I really remember really liking. Like, this is an early love for me as far as music goes. I don't know if I think my brother definitely had Heartbeat City and the Greatest Hits albums, and this is just right up my alley with just the pop sensibility, just the great Rick Ocasek. I think he wrote most of the music here. Yeah, I'm looking at, he wrote like every song. He co-wrote Moving in Stereo with Greg Hawkes. So just a great gift for melody, really catchy stuff. I love the incorporation of the synths. This to me is, I know this is 78, but I definitely, like you, Josh, I associate them as an 80s band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Heartbeat City was that was a big record in 84. That was all over the airwaves and stuff. And then there's so many songs on this record that I pretty much knew most of the songs here. I think there's 3 that I didn't know. I'm in Touch with the World, Don't You Stop, and All Mixed Up. I mean, those were ones that were never on the Greatest Hits album, and I never really remember hearing anywhere else. So, to me, they are more of a singles band because it's another one of those bands that I mostly do through the Greatest Hits. But it's just really good. They're a tight band. It's catchy, and there's variety here too. Like, Moving in Stereo is a really interesting song. I mean, like Fast Times at Ridgemont High aside, because yes, there's definitely those images that kind of come up, but that's just it's kind of like a quasi darker sound to it.
Do you know who they were going for? Is
that like Kraftwerk or something?
They're
like
trying
that?
to sound like Kraftwerk. Yep, that was exactly who their inspiration was.
Because then it definitely comes out with a synth there. The doot, 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 doot. Like, it's very like a staccato kind of synth that's got this tone to it that's very much like that. So that's not surprising. But yeah, it does have that sound in there. When listening to it this time around, for some reason, on You're All I've Got Tonight, there's a guitar part right before that leads up to the chorus. That's just, it's in the background, but it's so great. It's just this really kind of driving guitar part. It's got this really, it just really stood out to me, and it just added an extra layer. It's one of those things, a song that I've known for so many years. And I heard it a little bit differently, and I heard it in a much better way. And now I love that song even so much more than I did before. So, the Cars are great. I wish we were covering them more. I think this is it, right? Are we doing any cold listens with the Cars later on, John?
We are not. This is the only one.
Yeah, this is it. So and I'm surprised that Heartbeat City wouldn't made the 80s, so it's like 330 in the 80s, so we're not getting there. So unfortunately, we're not covering more. I'm glad we are doing at least some, but I'm a huge fan of them. And it just reminds me of being a kid again, really, for a lot of this stuff. So I think I don't really know much of the history of they don't strike me as an influential band, although I could be wrong. I think that they were kind of just riding the waves of kind of what was happening at the time. Maybe they were a little ahead of the curve, I think.
Well, Rick Ocasek was, I always say Ocasek, and I know it's Ocasek, so let me...
I just learned that last year.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, I'm sure there's people who are very angry at me for constantly going there, but yes, I know it's the AH sound. But he's a lot of production, right? Later, I think that's his legacy more so than the Cars sound itself. I always think of Weezer in particular. He
did the Blue album.
I made that
the Green album
John.
too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's great. I loved every song. The 3 new songs were a nice little. I really liked All Mixed Up. I think that was my favorite song I didn't know. I'm in Touch with Your World was probably the weakest. It's kind of the most avant-garde on here, and I don't necessarily mind the avant-garde. I kind of mind the repetitiveness. I don't know if it's maybe there's a little bit of krautrock in that, or something. But it's just, that's a song I heard once and it was stuck in my head, and I was like, because it was just the same three notes over and over again. So that was not my favorite, but there's everything else on here is just very, just big hits, great melody and big thumbs up. I love the Cars. This is a great album.
Yeah, I only knew the Cars, from their singles, and obviously there are many of them. So I had never listened to a Cars album before per se, and I was just really shocked about how many hits are on this album, how many songs I knew right out the gate. I mean, the first three songs are kind of, I think, feel like a lot of people would know. And this album is really solid from top to bottom. There's not really any weak songs on here. I'm in Touch with Your World. I like that song. I felt like it took elements of Talking Heads and Devo and like combined them and then kind of changed the sound midway through the song and sped it up. I thought that was interesting. You're All I've Got, it maybe is like the if there's a deep cut on this album, I don't know if that, or just like one of the kind of underrated songs. I feel like that is probably my favorite one on here, outside of like Best Friend's Girl, which is like kind of classic, hand clapping and really cool guitar part. I think the other great thing about the Cars is they kind of their prominent keyboard and electronic use. I feel like that's really savvily done and kind of contributes to their sound in a pop way that some of the other bands maybe haven't done it as much. I do feel like they have, they're not as out there as the Talking Heads, but there are some similarities in terms of kind of the way they use music there, in my mind. I definitely wrote down Weezer, John, especially on Just What I Needed. It feels like Rivers wanted to be that song on some level.
Sure. Especially the Green album. If you listen to the Green album, it sounds like Cars album in many ways.
And then Moving in Stereo, I had forgotten that I knew that song, but you're right, it's kind of electronic in the way that the Beverly Hills Cop theme is in some ways, and I'm surprised that this album is 78 because it does sound like later bands would be copying that or taking kind of influences or sounds from them and just making that more 80s for less of lack of a better phrase. This was also another easy album to listen to this week in kind of a different way than AC/DC, in that I was really surprised, just to kind of hearing them in a new light or just discovering these songs that I didn't know. And just the more I listened to this album, the more I appreciated it. And it kind of, I guess in some ways it is a good comparison to Weezer. It's also a band that I really like that, I can't say I've listened to any of their later stuff, but they have that kind of same sensibility and really good songcraft and just fun to sing to and move to. And I think that's probably the best compliment I can give them it's that this band is kind of repetitive at times in their songs, but it works for some reason. I mean, Let the Good Times Roll is not like a complex song by any means lyrically, but you're moving and singing along to it and not minding that, they sing Let the Good Times Roll like 16 times or something. And I made that.
But there's but the guitar part of that's just like a really interesting guitar part. It's like it's a unique kind of like offbeat kind of like, I don't know what the key signature, the time signature that they're using, but
it's like an upstrum or something.
Yeah. So the music is there are unique musical elements to it.
Yeah. So, and that's a good example of kind of the things that are scattered throughout this album that makes it worth listening to and solid overall. It's a good, I feel like it's a good, I keep coming back to the late 70s being like my decade, but this is like another example of just like really good, like pop fun music to listen to and just is indicative of kind of this era and how things are cohering in some way. So yeah,
I'm looking
highly recommended.
I'm just sorry, real quick. I'm just looking at this on Wikipedia. The first 3 songs, all of them clock in at 3 minutes and 44 seconds.
Exactly.
And then there's 3 other songs on the second side with "You're All I've Got Tonight," "Bye Bye Love," and "All Mixed Up" are either 4:13 or 4:14. So they had a certain like this song's going to be this long, like they were kind of doing. That's interesting.
Yeah, they honed in on I guess exactly the length they wanted.
Yeah.
So I know this album very well. I've listened to this album many, many times. I have long identified that I enjoy the Cars for sure. So I was like thinking to myself before I listened to this, I don't know really what I'm going to kind of be able to add, to this one. It's kind of just, and then I listened to it and I was shocked by what my take was. I still enjoy this album, but boy, in the context of our journey, if I'd listened to this album on its own, I think it holds up better, guys. I think with what we've been listening to recently, I think what shocked me a little bit was that the Cars had a little bit of a feeling like, the grunge groups that came after the 6 or 7 really big ones, and they kind of did the same things and they were fine and you enjoy it and they've maybe even sold more albums, but when you listen to it like 20 years later or in chronology, I was surprised by how much I liked other music that we've covered better than this album, to be quite honest. And I liked everything on this album, but like moving in stereo, right? Now that I've listened to lots of krautrock, I can appreciate that it's sort of a little bit like watered down krautrock. And there was a song that I thought, I never would have put 2 and 2 together, but I'm in touch with your world, right? Like it sounded like a Can song. And I was like, but Can kind of came at it from a different angle. We did Parallel Lines a couple weeks ago. I'll be honest, I don't know. This album's not as strong to me as Parallel Lines was. Apples to apples, I thought Parallel Lines was edgier and just did this act better. And that's not at all a knock on it. I still enjoyed this album. I think I was kind of shocked because I was prepared to just write a quick like, this is great. And, even if you'd given me a list of the albums before the decade, I probably would have had it higher than it actually was. But now that I've heard X-Ray Specs and Ultravox and Shoes and all of these really interesting bands, like my first thing is like, how did these bands not hit at the same level? Because in some ways those, when I think back on it, I still, Magazine, right, that we did last week, these are all albums that that moved me more than I think this one did. Now, there's a pop sensibility that this album, and for that matter, to me, the Talking Heads do all of this at a complexity level dialed up.
Yes,
and that was another thing that jumped out. Like, I was like, boy, like they're kind of in the lane with the Talking Heads, but the Talking Heads are really pushing the limit more. And I don't know if I really realized that the Cars to some degree are bits and pieces of all of these other. I thought they were like, oh, they're a new wave band, right? And they're one of the earliest new wave bands. But even I didn't love the Devo album, but even the Devo album was much more complex and stuff. So I think I was shocked at the fact that I enjoyed this album, but I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I thought I was because I started comparing it to a lot of the stuff we listened to, and then I started thinking to myself, I wonder why we're covering this album in the top 100 and some of these other albums are on the outside looking in. Especially the ones we did in the cold list and hot takes, right? That was where there were a lot that jumped out at me, like X-Ray Specs and Magazine, as I said before, Ultravox, Suicide, Shoes. I mean, there's a lot of these bands. Devo, right? They're all in the and it's very interesting that the Cars seem to have the formula, right, that I guess only Blondie also found.
I think.
And I think that was my takeaway, that I like this album, but I didn't like it nearly as much as I thought I was going to. And for an album I've listened to 15 times to get a totally new spin on it was somewhat shocking to me. And I don't want to sound negative on it. I really don't. But Matt, I think for you, it was like an old familiar friend. And this kind of goes to both of our personalities, doesn't it, a little bit? Because like for me, the old familiar friend thing, like I challenge that, right? I'm like, is it still like an old familiar friend, or like what's the context now? And I think for you, it's sort of like the context is still the context you approached it. And that's not negative, by the way. I don't mean to sound like I'm talking down. It's just, and I that's how I was expecting to come to this album, right? Like from my existing context, and instead it's really the first album we've done that I know really well that might have been hurt by the journey itself.
Well, it's like they kind of, the Cars have kind of taken all those elements from all those other bands and made it in some sort of more commercially friendly way, right? Because
they're brilliant at that,
yeah. Talking Heads, Devo, the Krautrock, I think all of that stuff I like more than the Cars, but there's something that gets in your head when you're listening to the Cars. I think.
Well, they have great songs. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's that Rick Ocasek has that skill of, like you said, being able to take it to. He's got the Tom Scholz thing, right? That we talked about with Boston, where he could just take it and just create these songs that are designed to be blasted on the radio. And there's an art to that, by the way. Like, I don't want to minimize that. I mean, being able to take a sound and synthesize it into something that, you know, is both radio friendly and, you know, has lasting artistic credibility is definitely something. I think I was just shocked for me at how not original it sounded. Not bad at all, but like it was in no way reinventing new ground. It was simply synthesizing new ground. And I don't know if I ever perceived the Cars that way until I listened to it this way.
Well, to me, they've always been there, you know, and so a band like certainly I didn't really know much Devo. I certainly didn't know like, you know, Magazine or, you know, a lot of the other bands that you mentioned there. And I think that those other bands are, you know, more interesting. They're more artistic, if you will, in terms of like being more adventurous and experimenting. The Cars really aren't doing a whole lot of that. It is kind of derivative of kind of what's come before them, although they were, you know, like I said, I think of them as like an 80s band, but this is still in the late 70s. But they still did something that was just so, it's more commercial, right? It's an easier sound. There's not a whole lot of challenging stuff in here. It's a very easy listen.
You know what it was like,
it's
guys?
It's really solid. So I don't know. Yes, you're right, John. And I think in the context, if you're comparing to like all these other things, it's probably going to get knocked down or a peg or two. But yeah, for me, it's just if a song is good, it's good, and I don't necessarily always need to have like the groundbreaking, you know, thing to kind of take me over to the next level. I can still really enjoy this, and have it be separate from something that's kind of blowing my mind in a more artistic. Like I think the Talking Heads is going to be a really, like I keep talking about that, but I think that's going to be a really fun listen for me to get into because I think I'm really going to like them. But I can still love the Cars just as much. But I take your point. I see what you're saying. At the same time.
I can too, but I'm starting to find that I'm becoming I'm demanding a little bit more for albums that I want to consider to be great albums. And I think they sound nothing like this band's sound. But I got a decidedly like Stone Temple Pilots vibe, where I like all of Stone Temple Pilots' albums, and I like a ton of their songs, and I'll stick up for them as being a really solid band that doesn't do it as much. But like this was sort of like the vibe I get for Stone Temple Pilots from, you know, other bands, right? That like they were clearly influenced by, all of whom are awesome, and they synthesized it and wrote these great radio-friendly, you know, versions of the rock songs, which is freaking hard to do, and had a charismatic frontman and all the stuff, right? And I will defend it, but I got that vibe for this. You know what I mean? It's like they kind of synthesized a bunch of stuff that I really like, and they made it potable, and there's an art to that, and maybe that's what their ultimate gift was, that they could take that and go with it, you know? But
I find it interesting that you're getting that take from this, and I see how it's different from some of the other bands, but I don't know if I'm seeing. Can you explain what the difference between this and the Blondie album?
I thought the Blondie album was much edgier. The sound of it was more visceral to me. The sound of it, there was both where Blondie was in 1976, right? Like they were right there with the Ramones in sort of their lane is punk pop. They made like an early punk album that also was pristinely pop, which there isn't really anything we covered up to that point in 1976 that did that. And it's still, there was an urgency to the Blondie album that still resonated with me.
Okay.
I think that probably is the best way to describe it.
Okay. No, it makes
Yeah.
sense. I don't think of that album as being like, yeah, edgy. I could see, but not as like it's not like experimental or arty. I guess is some of the other stuff.
Then this.
Then like the Talking Heads or like Magazine or something.
Well,
like
remember
that.
the Blondie album came out a year before any Talking Heads album we covered came out.
Right. But
That's
I'm
important. It's important in
Yeah.
terms of if we're talking about like if we're talking about it as a artistic piece, right? Like when something beats something by a year, you have to factor that in when something's a year behind it,
got
right?
it. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I see what John's saying. I think the Cars can be used as a springboard for exploring those other musicians. We've made this comparison before that there is a kind of a beginner's end of the spectrum in music that can branch out and lead to other things that you might be interested in. And I think the Cars may be in that area of the thing, but I enjoyed it though.
Oh, it's still a thumbs up for me.
Yeah.
That's why I'm glad you guys went first, because I was afraid with my take it was going to sound like I didn't like this album, and I did. I think I was just more shocked that I thought I was going to be talking about the Cars as a forerunner, and I was talking about them more as a solid follower.
Yeah, and I didn't think that it was. I was hearing a little bit of what you were saying listening to this. That it does. I never thought that it seemed like this. Like we're pushing new ground or trying something all new. It's just like we're kind of building off of what was happening before, which is why I was saying earlier. Like I don't know if the Cars influenced people the way that a lot of other bands did.
Yeah.
But this is just, to me, this was, and maybe it would have been different if I didn't know them as much, because I really do. I mean, this is one of the fewer bands that we've listened to in this decade that I've listened to a lot, and knew a lot of these songs already. So, I was going to go back to that and just really hone in on it, just continue to like it. But it's an interesting point, because there haven't been a whole lot of albums that we've listened to, we've been like, wow, this really sounds different. And if we have, the Rolling Stones album that we just did, Some Girls, was kind of like, that was interesting, because like, wow, of all this stuff that we just listened to, and now we're just getting this back to basics blues rock album, which is still great. It's kind of just returning to form. That was a little bit of a different take, but it was still the Rolling Stones doing something that they've done so well for so many years. So that's still a little bit different than this.
Yeah.
But they also genre bended in that, you know what I mean?
That's
and
true.
They kind
Yes.
of appropriated stuff, but it wasn't just them doing pure blues rock. I also, like earlier tonight, we talked about AC/DC, right? And that AC/DC album, and we compared them to Kiss, right? The difference is Kiss was 1972. Highway to Hell is 1979.
Yeah.
Even if we go off of like their similar, like Destroyer, right? The mid-career kit is 76, right? So like if somebody does the thing you're doing but beats you to it by 5 years, to some degree you do have to default to the person who does it first, because that's to some degree who you're listening to. No, and obviously everything comes from everything else, right? Like, everything is derivative.
Our
so I want to start
podcast
by
is
saying
evidence
that.
of that.
But I think this was the first example where I'm like, boy, the more reps I get, the more I can bring stuff in that I never like. The fact that we were all able to immediately identify the Kraftwerk influence in moving in stereo, that's not something I think we would have been able to do like 5 months ago, right? And now it's so inherent.
Yeah, and I
that
wouldn't
we were
have.
all like,
I wouldn't have thought
of course.
I wouldn't have thought of krautrock if I heard "I'm in Touch with Your World," before either. So yeah.
But did you hear Can when you heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, that's what I was saying. I was like, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So still a plus though.
Interesting.
And if you haven't heard this album, you still Just What I Needed, and it's
probably know
an
half the
all-timer.
album.
Right, yeah. There's all
you
kinds
really
of good songs. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So please leave with that. Great album. I think
Yeah.
just surprised from the Journey standpoint.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe not
it
as
was
high as you once thought. Yep.
not as high as I once thought, for sure.